Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he agree with his Associate Minister for Climate Change Issues that it is, quote-unquote, extremist for small developing countries like Tuvalu to push for a legally binding agreement from the Copenhagen Climate Conference?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I would disagree with the Associate Minister if that's actually what he'd said, but it wasn't. What he said was that Tuvalu walking out of the negotiations in order to make that point was extremist.
Dr Russell Norman.
Supplementary. Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can his government criticise Tuvalu's negotiating position and tactics when the Climate Tracker report that he trumpeted in this House just yesterday has just downgraded its ranking of New Zealand's negotiating position from medium to inadequate, where inadequate is the lowest ranking possible?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm quite satisfied on behalf of the Prime Minister, who's probably there by now, that those who are representing New Zealand will represent New Zealand's interests well. The only real question mark over New Zealand's credibility in these negotiations is the performance of the previous government of which he was a part, who oversaw record increases in carbon emissions.
The Honourable David Parker.
Is the Prime Minister aware that small island nations like Tuvalu have been brave in stepping outside the traditional mantra of the G77 by calling for controls on emission growths in major developing countries within the G77? And how then does he justify his minister criticising Tuvalu rather than congratulating them?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Copenhagen discussions are meant to be a negotiation, and New Zealand will take part in that negotiation. We're fully aware of the concerns of the small islands. It is a bit hard to negotiate if people leave the room when it gets to the hard bit.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can his government possibly justify calling Tuvalu's position extremist when in fact New Zealand now occupies the extremist position as bringing one of the worst pledges to the table at the climate conference, according to the very report from Climate Tracker that he was trumpeting yesterday?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, as I said before, the main question mark over New Zealand's credibility is that over the last decade we had among the fastest growth in carbon emissions of many developed countries, and that was under a government of which that member was part. New Zealand has a very credible position. We have a sensible and wide-ranging emissions trading system and a sensible target.
Dr Russell Norman.
Does he believe that Mr Gross's personal attack on Tuvalu's chief negotiator will help build New Zealand's relationship with our Pacific neighbours and foster a successful agreement at the conference?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, look, New Zealand, as the member will know, New Zealand has strong relationships with our Pacific neighbours, and as the member will also know, Mr Grosser is one of the more experienced international negotiators around, and I'm sure he'll contribute to whatever result we can get out of Copenhagen.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister understand that Tuvalu is currently being submerged underwater and could be wiped off the map by sea level rise resulting from climate change? And if so, can he understand why the delegates from Tuvalu may have strong feelings about the lack of action at the climate conference?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes. And we would also argue New Zealand is one of the few countries that's doing its bit, because we now have an emissions trading system in place after much discussion within the Parliament, which is more than almost any other country can say.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with Mr Gross's comment last week that New Zealand's ranking as medium by the Climate Tracker put New Zealand in respectable territory at the Copenhagen talks? And if so, will the government now revise New Zealand's negotiating position, given that New Zealand has just in the last few hours been downgraded by this very same report from medium to inadequate, the report that the Prime Minister gives so much weight to?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, we do have a credible and respectable position, and those who are representing New Zealand there will negotiate fundamentally in our interests to get some kind of outcome from Copenhagen that's of benefit to the whole planet. But New Zealand has a credible and respectable position, and we'll be sticking to it.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table the Climate Action Tracker report dated 16th of this month, which rates New Zealand's climate conference offer as inadequate.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Question number 7, Hon Annette King.